Hi, my name is Martin and I'm a cloud security architect, and in this video I'll be going through some of the recommendations and best practices related to virtual machines running in Azure. And this is largely based to things that I usually tend to see in cloud environments as I work with clients to analyze possible issues, possible things that could be needed to be changed to improve governance and security of Azure resources. So this is a virtual machine. You can see it here in our new Bobs app, which I'll be looking more into detail on how this or a similar virtual machine could be set up. So just a quick walkthrough here. We see that this virtual machine is connected to an availability set. It is a part of an application. It is also been placed in a proximity placement group. We see that there is no capacity reservation group here, so that is missing, so it's not part of one of those. We can see it's connected to a subnet, to the VNet. It has a connection to the network interface, basically is connected to an application security group, which in turn is being referenced by a network security group attached to the subnet proper. We can also see that the disk is indeed being encrypted. It is being, of course, protected. The confidentiality of the data at rest here is being protected by this disk encryption set, which of course it is dependent on a key vault. So this is a setup for a high availability machine. So let's go to the portal to see what we can see more there. So this is the same machine, but in the Azure portal. You can also see that there are indeed other virtual machines here, all being part basically into availability sets. So this is what you would do in a scenario where you have done a business impact analysis of the application that will be running on these virtual machines, and you identify that the requirement is 99.95%, which is Microsoft recommendations regarding availability sets. Just running a single virtual machine just gives you 99.9% SLA. So this is the reason for availability sets, basically used to run any kind of business critical applications. So this is what you would choose then how you would choose to set up this virtual machine in the case where a higher availability is required. So going through here, we can see that there is indeed a lot of options. So let's just quickly kind of mention what they are. First of all, we can see that there has indeed been a naming convention used here to assign a name to this virtual machine. Now this aligns somewhat to Microsoft recommendations, and I'll be showing you a website of where you can find more information on those in a minute. But one main issue or that you usually see is that there is no naming convention, and people just basically spin up virtual machine using different configurations, and there's a lot of mismatches regarding those configuration, and it's not all aligned to best practices basically. And just making sure that you're using a naming convention that is usually an indicative of people having followed the internal policies, Microsoft recommendations, and kind of general best practices. But if you see that there's a lot of virtual machines and they're basically named whatever, that's usually a indication that there are larger issues in that environment. So yeah, we have a naming convention. Let's check out the path tags. Here we see that there are no tags set up, so this is a clear issue here. You would see normally a lot of tags having been assigned to this virtual machine, or at least to its resource group. And you can also see that there is no tags here, right? So this is not aligned to what would be best practices regarding a tagging policy or kind of tagging framework of the tags that you should assign to resources. We can look a little more down here, and we see that it has one virtual machine disk, VM disk. That disk is indeed being protected by a disk encryption set, a double encryption here with platform and customer managed keys. So we also have the VM size. Let's see. And here you will find, if you are indeed new to Azure, you would want to check out which sizes are recommended to use for which purpose. And it also depends on if it's a development setup or if you're going to run a virtual machine in a production environment, and also what kind of application that would be used to run that. So Microsoft do have a lot of recommendations on which sizes are appropriate, but also you need to get a good understanding of the application or the requirements of the application. Microsoft Defender, that's a key component here to do security monitoring and to mitigate the issues, to see what Microsoft or Microsoft Defender for Cloud, previously Azure Security Center, is able to detect. What you also see is when you look at virtual machine is the extensions. Usually you can see a mismatch of different extensions, some legacy extensions maybe, or third-party extensions which aren't used anymore. Basically running on virtual machines, just basically eating CPU for no reason. So this is something that you would want to check to see that only the extensions that are approved are running and that they are configured correctly, and any other extensions that you might find is removed in an orderly fashion. We do have some information here about the availability setting here with the fault domain and the update domain. So this is really necessary to review here, and these virtual machines, since they are in a availability set, they are in different fault domains and update domains, which means that this is basically the reason why they have a 99.95% SLA instead of just 99.9%. We can scroll down a bit further down. We have a Bastion option here to provide additional security for accessing this virtual machine. We have auto shutdown, which is, I think, recommended for anything that is non-production like subscription to reduce cost over time. Disaster recovery, we have, different options there, of course, based on the business impact analysis on mean time to restore, that sort of thing, on how crucial and how quickly your virtual machine is necessary to be able to restore if indeed something does occur. So you would need to see what kind of disaster recovery scenario fits that application. You could do replication or do backups in the kind of old school way. Update management, ensuring that your Windows machine receives updates, and of course reviewing updates to see if they are indeed applicable, and just to make sure that the virtual machines don't remain unpatched for unacceptable periods of time. And we do have, inventory change tracking to make sure, basically it provides you with a capability to do asset management to make sure that you are aware of what is installed on the virtual machines, to be able to detect any changes which might not have gone through the change advisory board, or hasn't been done according to ITIL practices or processes, for example. So we also have a lot of possibilities to perform performance-related performance management regarding insights, collecting metrics, connecting diagnostic logs, settings. So this is all information that you would want to use or analyze if you detect that there are issues, or that the users or customers report issues accessing the application, so that then you would use these services to analyze and troubleshoot. Also some information here or options to review resource health and so on and so forth. So these are just a few of the options which you need to configure, which you need to have a look at. And well, the thing is, well, how do you keep track of all that? So the way I do it is as an infrastructure architect, someone who has worked with cloud security architecture. It's necessary to have some kind of framework which you use and you base your work on in investigating what the environment looks like, what the gaps might be regarding the baseline of how things look currently, and the desired state, what you want to achieve basically by improving governance and improving security. So what do we have here? So this important to note that this framework applies to any and all infrastructure really. It doesn't matter if it's outsourced, if it's your on-premise data center, your private cloud, if it's indeed Azure, or if it's another cloud service provider like AWS, Google Cloud, and so on. It doesn't matter even if it's a SaaS service which you just integrate with, since there might be things here related to Azure AD integrations, secure connectivity, whitelisting, MFA, sort of security requirements that you need to work with as a cloud security architect. But we do have these are basically platform services if you are familiar with TOGAF framework, but it also relates to, I mean, any basically framework that you use, such as ITIL or all others. Basically, it's just a way to conceptualize, work with all these types of categories of services, and put these services in the context of the infrastructure or the technical platform or a set of resources which is used to run an application. And then you're basically, as an infrastructure architect, you would see, well, how do all these types of services related to governance and how do all these services related to security apply to the resources or the application or the infrastructure, the core infrastructure that is in focus. And this is just a kind of the first conceptual level. There are 3 levels. There is the conceptual level, which is the most abstract. There is the logical level, where you get into more details. And there's also the physical level, which is the most detailed and also being directly related to the actual application or the set of resources which you are working with. But this is a way to conceptualize and work with it. So if we go down 1 level into the abstraction, you can see that these quite abstract have now been broken down into different sub-services, basically. And this is how you start to kind of see that red thread between the really abstract level and the more detailed level, where you kind of go into exactly which kind of IaaS services, container services, PaaS service, or serverless or services that you would be using in Azure or in AWS and in Google Cloud, who knows. But at least you start to get a sense on what this is about. So putting now in context the virtual machine, just to quickly go through this is platform management. So this is related to how you would set up the subscription itself, or rather the management group structure, how you would configure policies, blueprints, that sort of thing, to restrict what could be done in different environments, and to establish control basically of the cloud environment in its entirety, not the raw resources. Then we have the resources here, and this is basically how you would then access or configure or basically access these resources. And there we saw the Bastion host option. We also usually see a VPN setup with jump hosts to enable secure RDP access to resources, and this is basically how you would then look at implementing this service, would be implementing those sort of solutions to provide secure access to machines that shouldn't be directly exposed to the internet, which would be the default option in the portal. You have cost management and billing. Basically, it corresponds to in Azure. So this is basically related to the costs, budgets, alert thresholds when budgets are exceeded in Azure. Here we have also some policies here, management that is basically any of these. You could basically redesign such an infrastructure framework to suit what you yourself call these different types of services. It's just about what the intent of these services are. So this would be things like how you would set up the configuration of the resources, pre-approving, using golden images, using basically some repository maybe for JSON templates, that sort of thing. Asset tracking would be inventory and change tracking here in Azure. We have Azure Active Directory. You could have domain services here. You could have DNS. This is about those types of services related to things that you need to be able to make things work. Scheduling, maybe not so much here, but if you have PowerShell jobs, for example, things that happen according to a schedule, it could be virtual machines or containers being spun up according to schedule to do some sort of processing staging related to things related to how you create virtual machines and so on. So there will be, if you want to see more about this architecture framework, please go ahead and check that out. But you can at least see here now that, this framework makes it possible to analyze and review and reach conclusions about the virtual machine. So this is what I'll be switching over to now, to look at more about what would the recommendations be for all these services, on how you would apply that to a virtual machine, basically in running in Azure. Because there are a lot of things, and of course these relate to different Azure services. So you need to have this kind of type of architecture framework in the back of your head, or in your mind, basically, when you review cloud environments and review cloud resources. So going back here, you can see here that we have basically what would be the corresponding services here to that architecture framework. Of course here, log collection, log analysis, being of course log analytics workspaces. We have Microsoft Defender, of course, as the IT security monitoring implementation of that architecture or that security service. So, there is a lot of information available when you start up using Azure. And even if you have been using Azure quite a long time, it's still a lot of information on how to set up a virtual machine according to best practices, according to Microsoft recommendations, and making sure then that the virtual machine adheres to your platform services, the governance services and the security services that you have in place for your on-premise data center, and that you have the equivalent controls and services to protect and to maintain control of your cloud or your Azure resources. So what you would start looking at is looking through the documentation. I will provide links to all these sites, which I will go through now, and in the video description, so have a look at that. But starting out, you do have a lot of information, of course, on the Microsoft sites, which is interesting to have a look at. Now, another thing here to take into consideration as you create virtual machines is to of course, make sure that you understand the different VM sizes and that you find the correct size for your virtual machine, depending on how you would want to use it and what kind of application it would run on. There are limits to the subscriptions where you would need to increase your quotas if you exceed those subscriptions, but it's easily done. And let's see if we go to then. Well, here is more information regarding the different VM sizes, and of course you would look into reducing cost, implementing the cost management service in the infrastructure architecture framework by selecting a few of these sizes and only approving those for use, and also relating that to which type of environment subscription it is. If you are new to Azure and you want to make well, estimate the costs, Microsoft offers a pricing calculator where you could see how much one of these resources, different types of resources, of course, is possible to have a look at here, and you would basically get an estimated cost here per month of what that would be. Of course, the basic recommendation on moving resources to Azure is to not use virtual machines if it can be avoided, but instead to reinvent applications to make it possible for them to run on app service or containers or some sort of other infrastructure besides virtual machines. Virtual machines are most expensive regarding security and regarding governance, because you need basically the same controls as you have on the on-premise data center. So, but we do of course have enterprise grade applications which are not possible to transform into PaaS or run on app service or similar services in Azure. So you still then of course have virtual machines, but keep in mind that it's a challenge. You basically moving fixed costs from your data center to flexible cost or dynamic costs in Azure. So it's the cost management service needs to be implemented properly with tagging and with budgets and alerts, threshold alerts, and constantly working with optimizing costs based on resource usage of the servers or applications. Also working with Shutdown scripts and starting up applications again as users return to work, for example. The next thing when creating virtual machines is, well, you have an image you can choose, of course, Linux and Windows. For more secure environments, as I tend to work with clients, organizations which are maybe heavily regulated in the financial industry, for example, there might be other larger organizations which have a lot of security requirements from their information security management framework, whatever framework that they might be using. They would have more stringent requirements regarding which images are required to use. So the Center for Internet Security provide hardened images to be used in Azure. So this is something that you would look into if you indeed want to achieve a higher level of security for your virtual machines in Azure. So this is definitely worth considering, and it also is likely a requirement. We also have they also have a really good information regarding on how to best practices regarding securing Microsoft Azure resources. So do check out their benchmarks. They are free and they provide a lot of good information on how to set up security for your environment. So this is really beneficial, and there are usually quite a lot of issues where cloud environments, cloud resources are basically not at all aligned to this type of benchmark at all. This is what you usually find as in the way of issues and challenges. One other thing that you need to consider when uh, installing virtual machines is to, like I mentioned, to have a clear idea of exactly which virtual machine extensions that you want to use, be it for automation, be it for monitoring, or be it for basically implementing threat management service, as mentioned in the infrastructure framework, basically anti-malware, antivirus solutions, that sort of thing. Of course, being necessary to implement since you are using virtual machines in this case. So this is something that you also need to make sure that these are up and running, that it's not misconfigured, that provisioning has succeeded, and all these. And there's usually a lot of issues with extensions not having been properly installed, or that they're not reporting information back to analytics workspace or a solution deployed therein. So this is really crucial, which needs to be reviewed, of course. You tend to find a lot of things. Microsoft also provides this information regarding a naming convention, and like I mentioned, this is basic IT hygiene. Going back, I mean, basically how many years has it been? So you would want a naming convention just so you can quickly identify resources which don't align to your internal security requirements, your internal policies, that sort of thing. And this is one way to make analysis basically easier for your cloud architects or cloud security architects to review resources and easily detect things which don't align or adhere to those set of policies. So we have basically explanations here on how to what the naming convention could look like. There are abbreviations here suggested. There's also need for you to add basically new abbreviations, as this doesn't maybe cover all the types of resources which you can create in Azure. But at least you get a good picture of here by reading this what the naming convention should look like. So I would say in any type of cloud Azure environment which has more stringent requirements on it, a naming convention is of course necessary. The next thing is to define a tagging strategy, and as you remember, the virtual machine we took a look at didn't have any tags. So this is a tagging strategy. This is information regarding to how to set one of those up, what it could include in the way of tags which would be required, and basically you could then review or analyze which tags have been set and make sure that these resources are being governed by the different teams in a correct fashion, since it would be the responsibility of different teams to assign tags to the resource groups or to the resources to make sure that they have implemented these asset management basically service from the internet or infrastructure architecture framework as mentioned. So a tagging tagging strategy or tagging policy with clear instruction and examples is something that you would see well, that would have to be in place if you have implemented governance and security for that environment at least, and then would use that policy to review which resources are don't adhere to this policy, and which would then be necessary for the different teams to correct. Now, one thing to note here is regarding the naming convention is you also have to consider things like, well, it of course is good to specify which type of environment is. It's basically well, if you collect logs to the same workspace for analysis, if you have one single point of log normalization and analysis, well, this could be necessary to have a think about, since you would want to know if logs are generated by a virtual machine which is in a development environment, or if it's a similar virtual machine for the same application but is running in a production environment. There's also consideration which is necessary due to including the region, since some resources are possible to move. So for example, you could move virtual machines across regions, but you can't rename virtual machines. So it doesn't make sense to include regions in virtual machine names if you see a scenario where you would want to or have to move virtual machines. Of course, you can use the name if your policy is to basically create new resources only, and then decommission, deallocate and decommission, remove, delete existing resources then, basically not moving them. But you do have at least the possibility to move virtual machines with the resource mover, which is available in Azure here, right? So that is something that is worth considering. Now, regarding the best practices, you do have a lot of information related to this on Microsoft page regarding the Cloud Adoption Framework guidance. So this is really good information on how to secure and how to govern resources in Azure. So this is definitely related to virtual machines. A lot of information here on how to implement these governance services and security services in Azure, basically, and for the IaaS resources, and more specifically for virtual machines. You do also have access to the Architect Center, and this is a really good repository for finding architecture-related content. Of course, this is, a lot of information here, but this is really interesting also to look at different architectures that is based on using virtual machines, depending on what kind of application you would want to run on these virtual machines and how the service would be exposed, if it's only internal or if externally exposed to the internet, to external clients or things like that. There's another set of information here also related to security, specifically the Azure Security Benchmark, and there's two versions, the version 1 and version 2, version 3 as well, I guess. So this is a lot of information regarding security. So here you would look at security aspects as a cloud security architect, depending on which type of service different teams are using in Azure. So some teams could be using virtual machines, another team using containers, and another team could basically be doing APIs. So this is a good repository for information regarding to security. So you could provide insights on how to implement security-related services for different resources. And this is also interesting since there is at least this shared responsibility model, which governance services and security services are possible to implement basically in Azure. You have, of course, you yourself have the most responsibility for virtual machines to implement the governance services and security services in the same way that you have done so for the data center or the resources in the on-premise data center. But if you're using PaaS, app service, then you have basically less responsibility yourself, since Microsoft takes over some responsibility for managing the underlying infrastructure that is used to run app services. And of course, you have things like serverless services, logic apps consumption, function apps to some extent, but also APIs, API management things, which of course require the least amount of services, governance services and security services So it's easier to support those initiatives which use serverless services in Azure. So have a look at the security benchmark. It contains a lot of information. One of the key components to working with security, specifically in Azure, is Azure Security Center, now called Microsoft Defender for Cloud, where you have a lot of really good information regarding what the current status of security in your environment, basically being illustrated by the secure score. And of course, your work is basically to implement the security recommendations, remediate issues, implement security solutions that mitigate specific threats to your environment, to your resources. And the Microsoft Defender for Cloud is basically your go-to solution in the Azure portal for this. And so this is a lot of work usually, and of course working with detecting false negatives and false positives, that sort of thing, to make sure that there's no noise in your environment, which kind of decreases the effectiveness of the controls, since people do tend to get tired of viewing red all the time and basically start ignoring things if it's too many false positives. So this is another, of course, good information to read up on how to work with security in your day-to-day tasks. So this is basically how you would work with making sure that you have a structured way on how to work with governance and security controls for virtual machines. You would then support the different teams that are looking to using different Azure services for their resources, and you would then analyze, of course, how things look in the environment, if people are doing things correctly, and make sure that they are following the policies, the naming they are aligning within the naming convention, the tagging policy, and making sure that things are being done in a proper way. Basically, to support the teams who are working with these types of services, to make sure that they are indeed performing their due diligence when it comes to governance, to make sure that they have secured their applications regarding all these the network access, the authentication, the authorization, the Microsoft Defender recommendations, so on and so forth. And to make things easier for you to do that as a cloud security architect or a cloud architect in supporting the teams, you can also, of course, use our basically our policies feature here to make sure that to make sure that different teams are adhering to these best practices, to these benchmarks, by using these different checks here. So you can audit the environment, and especially since you might have 20 or 30 subscriptions and thousands of virtual machines maybe spread around the entire globe. Basically, you need some sort of solution to do this in a efficient way, since the time it takes to analyze how things have been configured is quite substantial, even in smaller environments. So this is one of the ways that we have tried to solve this issue. Basically, there not being enough cloud security architects or enough time to perform manual analysis of environments at the end of the day. So these checks here are based on the best practices, recommendations, and so on. And you could then basically see the issues that are detected for different machines, virtual machines here, as you enable. You see here, there's basically no policies enabled right now, but you can enable this and you would see the errors here in the same way as if you have a look at the subscription, you would see here the possible issues in new bumps. So, well, thank you for taking the time to uh, listen to me talking more about best practices and recommendations on how to work with, well, in this case, virtual machines, specifically in Azure, as a cloud security architect, and also a little bit about the information that is out there that you could use to learn more about how to set things up in a correct and proper way, basically. And I, for one, will be very happy if indeed is the case that we see properly configured virtual machines and properly set up cloud environments going forward. So yeah, hope this helped, and thank you. Bye.